Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Greg Guilford. I'm from HR Solutions. Sorry for starting a little bit late. We were waiting for a few other attendees to join us, and they have now, so we are going to start. This webinar is on managing those with caring responsibilities. It is going to be presented by my colleague Alison Blackhurst, who you should be able to see on your screen shortly. And Sue Watson's also with us, who is our HR Operations Manager. The topic today is going to be on managing those with caring responsibilities. If my colleague could move the slides forward, we will show you the screens. Alison?
Yes, I have done.
I think you may have paused your screen. Okay. So I'm going to hand you over to Alison, who is going to run through the topics we're going to cover today, as well as talk through each of those topics. Throughout the session, if you have any questions, there is a panel in the bottom right-hand corner of your GoToMeeting panel that allows you to ask questions. We will log those and answer those at the end, but we will answer every question. If there's something a bit more complicated, then we'll probably come back to you offline rather than keep everybody waiting on the call. Okay, I'll pass you over to Alison.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. In this webinar, we will mainly be concentrating on the practical aspects of managing workers who are juggling their work and their caring responsibilities, which could be for an older relative, a neighbour, or somebody who is seriously ill or disabled. But before we do that, we will take a look at the legal rights that apply to carers. These are the right to time off for dependents, right for flexible working, and right not to be subjected to a detriment. But before we start, how many carers do you actually employ? Do you know? That may sound a silly question, but according to Carers UK, the number of carers is set to grow from 6 to 9 million in the next 30 years, so an increase of 50%. The CIPD estimates that we have 3 million UK workers, that's 1 in 9 of our employees, who are providing some form of care to an older, disabled or seriously ill person. And they also expect this number to rise. We have an ageing population. By 2021, 23% of the population, that's almost a quarter of us, will be aged over 65, and the relative proportion of those aged over 65 is increasing. Carers are commonly, but they're not exclusively, of course, aged over 30, and the peak age for caring is aged between 45 to 64. Now, at the moment, 69% of those who are aged 50 to 64 are in work, which is the highest on record. A third of all workers will be aged over 50. Just to put that into context, last year this figure was 1 in 4, and it was 1 in 5 in 1992. The insurance company Aviva predicts that workers aged 50 and above will become the largest group in employment by 2024, which isn't that far off, and that will be 1 in 3 of all employees. So what we've actually got is an ageing population that needs caring for, and we also have an ageing working population that is doing much of the caring. So it may not be something that you have had to manage at the moment, but the chances are it's going to be an issue which will come to the forefront more and more over the next few years. The reason that we said how many carers do you employ is that the CIPD and Westfield Health did some research, and they found that only 20% of employers know how many carers they actually have. Basically because it's a responsibility that employees often do not disclose. Now, the reasons for that are probably fear of being viewed negatively, fear of hurting their career progression, and also fear of job insecurities. Caring impacts very heavily on employees, but if not managed properly, it can also seriously affect employers. And if you don't know who your carers are, then you're sitting on a time bomb effectively. The effect to employers can be increased and unpredictable absences, reduced productivity if somebody's mind is elsewhere and they're worried about balancing the work and their caring responsibilities and what's going on back at home, and sometimes the loss of valuable employees. The people that are doing the caring, these could be your most experienced and skilled employees. Carers very often have no choice about the demands that are placed upon them, and unless their employers can accommodate these, sometimes the only option actually is resignation. Allowing them the flexibility they need to cope with the caring demands can pay off hugely, though, in terms of loyalty and commitment. So turning to the legal protection first of all, just so that we have that we're looking at all of this in context before we look at the practical aspects of this. Firstly, the right to take time off for dependents. Who has this right? Well, basically it's everybody. All employees have the right to take reasonable, unpaid time off for emergency care for dependents, irrespective of their length of service. What can it be used for? Well, it applies if a dependent falls ill or gives birth, probably unlikely in this situation, but certainly falls ill is likely, or is injured or assaulted. Time off can be to make an arrangements for the provision of care for a dependent who is ill or injured, for the death of a dependent, because of unexpected disruption or termination of arrangements for the care of a dependent, and also to deal with an incident which involves the child of the employee and which occurs unexpectedly at a time when an educational establishment is responsible for the child. So those are the sorts of things that this leave can be used for. Next question, is it paid? No, it's not. So effectively the take-up isn't very high. Some employees may prefer to use flexi-time if their employers have a flexi-time scheme. Others might use holiday or time off, take time off in lieu if they're allowed to do this. Some may pull a sickie. I'm not saying that we would recommend that, of course, but it is something that some employees may do in these sort of circumstances. Now, one of the common questions is, are there any limits on the amount or on the frequency of time off? And the answer is, well, the right to take time off for dependents only covers unforeseen emergencies. So it's time that's taken off in response to an unexpected event that affects the dependent, or to make the necessary long-term arrangements for that dependent to be cared for. So if the problem was reasonably foreseeable, like a hospital visit or a dental check or something like that, then your employee would probably not be entitled to time off work under this legislation. In the case of a death, the time off might include time to deal with the consequences of a bereavement. It could include making the funeral arrangements, attending the funeral and other matters, including registering the death and applying for probate and that sort of thing. But it's not a right to take time off for compassionate leave. There is no right in the UK to have time off for compassionate leave. And the amount of time is reasonable. I hope the way I said that conveyed that that's in inverted commas. It's a reasonable amount of time off to deal with the situation. So it's the time that you actually need to make the alternative care arrangements rather than to actually provide the care. I mean, normally what we're looking at here is a few hours or a couple of days. Just to give you an example, if you have someone who is caring for her mother and the mother has a fall and breaks a hip, then the time off would be that is necessary to make arrangements for the care of the mother, but not to be personally responsible for that ongoing care. So it would be time to take her to A&E or to accompany her to A&E and to sit at the appointment with her, but it wouldn't be time if she was admitted to undertake any hospital visits or checks. It wouldn't be the time to take her to follow-up checkups or to have any extra x-rays or anything like that, nor would it be time taken to make meals for her while she's unable to do this herself. Does the employee have to give notice in advance? Well, because it's emergency time off for dependents, it's not normally practical to do that. If you knew in advance it was going to happen, then it wouldn't be unexpected. Because of this, there's no prescribed method in the legislation for applying for dependent leave, and the tribunals have usually found that a quick telephone call or a word with your manager could well be sufficient notification. The legislation also makes it clear that in certain circumstances your employee might not be able to explain the absence until he or she actually returns to work, and that again is acceptable too. The right to time off doesn't apply, however, unless the employee tells the employer the reasons for the absence as soon as is reasonably practicable, except where this can't be complied with until after the employee's return to work. So in the example that I gave before, it would be unreasonable if you're sitting in an ambulance taking your mother to the hospital to actually expect you to ring up and actually say, look, I'm on my way to the hospital. Although, of course, a lot of employees would do that, but there's nothing that you as an employer can do about that, provided that the employee does let you know as soon as they can. So on arrival at the hospital, if they have a mobile phone with them, for example. What if you can't authorize it? Well, the bad news is that you don't have any choice, provided that the employee lets you know as soon as reasonably practicable. It's automatically unfair to dismiss anybody, and again, let's remind ourselves that's irrespective of their length of service, for asserting the statutory right to a reasonable amount of unpaid time off to deal with emergency situations which involve a dependent. If you refuse, well, that can result in a complaint to an employment tribunal. The tribunal can award compensation, and the compensation will be assessed on what the tribunal considers is just and equitable in the circumstances. The normal 3-month time limit normally applies, so an employee who wishes to bring a complaint should present that within 3 months of the date when the refusal occurred, although the tribunal does have the discretion to extend this period. So what processes would we be advising employers to have in place to deal with the right to time for dependents? Firstly, we would say have a policy which outlines the right and the procedure so that everybody is aware of it and they know what they have to do. It's also worth giving your employers some guidance on this so that they are clear, especially since the legislation doesn't actually define reasonable, and what one person thinks is reasonable clearly could be different to somebody else's. So if you give them some examples, then that is a sensible thing to do. How does this legislation help carers? Well, what it does do is it enables them to take short periods of time off in an emergency. Frankly, most employers traditionally would allow that anyway. Very few people are going to say, no, you can't take that time off if there is a real emergency situation. But they do have the legal right to do this and not to be dismissed for doing so. Where this particular legislation doesn't really help carers is it doesn't help them in terms of accommodating any routine, regular appointments like hospital, doctors, opticians, dental, social work. And all of these things can be very, very hard to arrange around other commitments, and often you don't have any choice as to the date or time of these appointments. And as we said before, the amount of time off is limited to the time needed to make alternative care arrangements. It's not time off to actually provide that care. So, as I said, normally a few hours or a couple of days. Second piece of legislation that may help carers is the right to request flexible working. So first of all, what is flexible working? Well, in terms of the regulations, it's not things like flexi-time schemes that enable you to work core hours and then fit the rest of your working hours around your particular commitments. So you may decide to turn up late one day and leave earlier the next day, for example. In terms of the flexible working regulations, what we're talking about is either a change to a worker's regular working hours. So, for example, a request to start later or to start earlier, to have shorter breaks and enabling that person to leave earlier, to change the working days, or to change from full-time to part-time work, for example. So it's a change actually to the contracted hours, a change to the contract of employment. It could be a change to the tasks that the person does. if, for example, their caring responsibilities mean that they don't want to be away a long distance away from home in case there is an emergency, or they don't want to be driving because they can't do that, or they feel that they're unable to cope with any overnight stays because they have to be home to care for their dependent. Or it could be a change in the location of work. For example, the person may actually say, could I work from home on a regular basis? Now, as you can see from the examples I've given, some of these requests could be quite minor. For example, a delay in the start of working time to care for the person beforehand. Others can be more significant. Who has this right? Well, this isn't everybody, unlike the emergency time off for dependents. It's employees who have 26 weeks service or more may make a request for flexible working. People like workers, agency workers, members of the armed forces, office holders, or those on employee shareholder contracts, and they are quite rare, but all of those people are exempt. So effectively, employees with 26 weeks service or more. And the process for doing this, well, the good news is that that is much, much simpler than it used to be. What we had a couple of years ago was a very, very tight timetable and schedule of events where you had to get through various stages within deadlines, to meet deadlines. So, but all you actually have to do now is the employee has to make a request in writing. Email is okay, by the way, so it doesn't have to be a letter. Email is fine. The employer would check that the request is signed and dated, and that it states that it is a flexible working request, and the employee is asked to confirm that no previous applications have been made in the last 12 months, because you can only make one application per year. The employee should set out the desired working pattern. So what do they want to change, and how this will impact on the business. So what's the effect going to be? Yeah? And how could the request be accommodated? So there's nothing to stop the employee putting suggestions as to, okay, if I had a shorter working hours, then I can still fit in this amount of work by this time, and I will make up the rest later on a Friday or something like that. And the employee also specifies when he or she would like the change to take place. So they do that to start with. The duty on the employer is then to consider the request in a reasonable manner and in a reasonable timescale. Now again, reasonable timescale, what is that? Well, the guidance from ACAS suggests that that will be 3 months in total to see the entire procedure through. So from receipt of the letter to meeting with the employee, if you do that, discussing any changes, maybe negotiating something slightly different, or maybe agreeing to it, or maybe refusing it, and if you give the right of appeal against that refusal, then again, all within the 3-month window. So the employer's the action on the employer is first of all to confirm the receipt in writing. Then you know you've got that date in your mind. Check that the employee is eligible to make the request. Do they have 26 weeks service? And check that you have all the information that you need in order to consider the request. If you agree to the request, then fine. This should be confirmed in writing, specifying the date on which the new contractual arrangements will apply and confirming what they are. If you can't simply agree to the request, then you would meet with the employee to discuss this. No statutory right to be accompanied at this meeting, but again, the ACAS code suggests that this should be encouraged. Yeah. And if the request is refused, and it is important to note that employers do have the right to refuse flexible working requests. So this is not a right to impose flexible working, it's a right to make a request. If the request is refused, then there isn't a statutory right of appeal anymore. However, the ACAS code recommends that the opportunity to appeal should be given. Now, how many requests can be made? An employee can only make one application each year, and an accepted application normally means it's a permanent change to that person's terms and conditions unless otherwise agreed. So if they want to go from full-time work to part-time work and you agree that, then there is no right to return to the previous terms or hours or tasks or working pattern if that employee's circumstances then change. There's nothing to stop you agreeing to a temporary change if you wish to do that, but the regulations actually are dealing with permanent changes effectively. Now, employers sometimes may want to agree to a temporary change because that could work best for circumstances such as bereavement or short-term, really serious care issues where clearly the employee is not going to be able to continue doing that on a long-term basis. Another solution is going to have to be sought. So there is nothing to stop you agreeing to a trial period if you want to do that, and nothing to stop you agreeing to a temporary change after which the employee would then revert to his or her previous working pattern. Now, as I said before, yes, you can refuse the request, but do take care on that. You need to ensure that you're giving the request proper consideration and that you can actually justify your refusal in case it's challenged. Now, the regulations set out 8 reasons for refusal. Yeah, these are things such as detrimental effect on the ability to meet customer demand, inability to reorganize work within available staffing, inability to recruit additional staff. Yeah. You will be expected to choose one of these 8 reasons. Our advice would be, please only choose one of them. It's kind of tempting to cherry pick and say, well, yes, 3 or 4 of those apply, so I'm going to say it's all of those. But of course, then you have to be able to justify all of those. And a flexible working request should be given proper and full consideration. If not, what are the risks? The main risk is discrimination. Employers can't complain because they feel your decision is unfair or unreasonable, or they just don't like it. But they may attempt to claim that a decision is based on discrimination arising from a protected characteristic. Now, in the sense of people who are caring, usually that protected characteristic is going to be age or disability. So a tribunal will look to see that you have some evidence that shows that you properly considered the request and that you had good reasons for refusing it. So whilst HR is very good at creating paper trails, they are very useful in showing your investigations trying to reach a decision. So if you have some facts and figures to say, look, the reason that we couldn't agree to this is because this is the effect it would have had. You know, we can't operate our business in that particular instance. If you have a paper trail that says that you went back to the employee and you thought about it over a period of a few days and you went back with a counter suggestion but they weren't willing to consider any other alternatives, all of those sort of things will show that you actually did try your hardest to see whether you could accommodate that request. So ensure that you've got enough evidence to justify your decision. And also, if you are thinking of turning down somebody's request, bear in mind a lot of these requests will impact on the employee's pay. If somebody is actually asking to reduce their hours, for example, then that would be accompanied by a pro rata cut in wages. So they're not going to do that lightly unless they absolutely have to. Yeah? They are making a request because they want to carry on working for you. And as we said before, a lot of carers are your most experienced staff. So just before you say no, do think about what are your costs of replacing that person, of retraining that person, of losing their experience that they've got of the company and your ways of working and good client relationships that they've built up over the period of working for you, all of those things, and do balance those against any potential inconvenience, as well as the employee relations consequences of any refusal. What processes should you have in place? Well, as I said before, this is easier to manage than it used to be. Before, the procedure was very rigorous and it had to be followed to the letter, but it's still a good idea to have a policy in place that sets out the right to request flexible working and the procedures to follow. It's also a good idea to have a request form and to ask the employee to complete that, because not only then do you ensure that you're getting full details as to what the employee wants to do, but you are actually asking them to really think about how that can be accommodated and the effect on the business. So it can encourage a bit more realistic debate, and also some template letters are quite useful to accept or reject the request. Now again, how does this help carers? Because that's the focus of this webinar. Yeah. Well, it does enable people to ask if they can change their regular contractual terms. So that may help some carers where the needs are routine and they can be predicted. So somebody who needs to start later every morning because they know that they've got to get an elderly person up and dressed and give them their breakfast before they set off for work, or where they need medication at certain times in the day, for example, it can be very useful for that sort of thing. Where it doesn't help carers particularly is that it's not really designed to cope with situations that are going to change on a day-to-day basis. And the demands that are placed on carers could be very, very unpredictable. The other thing with caring for elderly or disabled people is that those demands may be subject to regular change as the person's health condition changes. And of course, as we said before, employees can only make one flexible working request in each 12-month period. So if an employer chooses to apply these rules rigorously, then once you've made your one request, that's it, you can't make another one. And finally, the right not to be subjected to a detriment. Discrimination is the key risk area here, really, because employees who are subjected to a detriment, and what do we mean by detriment? That could be lack of training, lack of promotion, or treated in any way, basically, that's to their disadvantage. If you subject them to a detriment on the basis of their caring responsibilities, they may well be protected under the Equality Act. Now this would be on the grounds of what's called associative discrimination. So if your employee is caring for somebody who has a protected characteristic, i.e. in this particular case we'd be looking probably at age or disability, then if you subject your employee to the detriment on the grounds that they care for somebody who is disabled, then they may claim protection under the Equality Act. Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, as we all know, discrimination claims are the most expensive and the cap is unlimited on all of those. So women, for example, who are refused flexible work could bring a sex discrimination claim on the basis that we usually have more female carers than the male ones, which is a very good reason to take care to consider any requests fully and to make sure that you can justify any refusals. A disability claim could be made if you have a disabled employee and you fail to make a reasonable adjustment for that employee. However, the requirement to make reasonable adjustments only applies to workers who are disabled themselves, not to discrimination by association. Yeah. Part-timers mustn't receive less favourable treatment than full-timers. And we just need to be a little careful as well when you're looking at flexible working and changing things, to bear in mind that any changes to working hours must still comply with the minimum breaks set out in the working time regulations. So if anybody's working hours are 6 hours or more, they must have a break of 20 minutes or more, and they must have 11 hours break between each shift, and they must have 2 days off per fortnight. Just pause for breath there, because that's the legal bit over and done with. That's the heavier duty side of this webinar. The next thing we're really looking at is practical considerations. So, okay, we've looked at the legal entitlements that carers have. We found that they may help them in some way, but actually they are very limited in the help that they provide. So how can we better help a large proportion of our workforce in order to actually stay working with us and still give their all to you as an employer? So how to better assist carers, yeah? First of all, before you face this situation, yes, it's worth thinking about it in terms of your employees and the organisation generally, rather than making decisions on an individual basis. Yeah? So consider having a policy, or if you don't want a full policy, then some wording in your employee handbook that covers caring responsibilities and that actually encourages carers to come forward at a very early stage to discuss their concerns. The second thing which will help you enormously, particularly if you're a larger organisation and you're multi-site, would be to give your line managers clear guidance on how to handle such situations and also what they are authorised to agree to. So what I mean by that is any boundaries in terms of, for example, authorising time off, giving extra paid leave if that's something that you want to allow them to do, are then allowed to amend your rules. Now the sort of things I'm meaning here are things like, for example, you may have a rule that says personal phone calls are not allowed during working hours because you don't want everybody taking lots and lots of time up and disrupting work by taking personal phone calls. But for carers that could be very, very difficult to comply with because they need to be on call in case there's an emergency. So you may actually decide to allow your managers to amend the rules or disregard the rules for those in those particular circumstances. Another thing is authorising short-term advances of salary or loans. Well, I'll go on to that later on, but if you give your managers guidance on what they can approve and can't approve, then that's going to help you ensure that employees are all treated fairly and consistently and could lead to less grievances or resentment later on. Stress the need for empathy and reassurance, but the guidance always has to be as well, don't make promises that can't be kept. Now, the individual, if you're facing a case of this, I think each case has to be treated individually within the parameters that we've described before. So don't try to anticipate the needs because each situation is going to vary hugely, and it also may well be changing as the health and the circumstances of the person being cared for changes. So as I said before, some of the needs may be regular and predictable, i.e. avoiding long-distance travelling, overnight stays. You may need to do a risk assessment if constant tiredness is a risk because the employee is getting up at night regularly to look after somebody. It may be a change to working hours, such as a later start in the morning or a longer lunch break so that the employee can return home to feed or change the person being cared for. But generally speaking, it's going to be more complicated than this, and ongoing flexibility is going to be key to retaining your employees. So find out as much as your employee will tell you. Try to ascertain what support systems are in place and are planned, and what flexibility does he or she actually need, and also what he or she wants to suggest as to how to manage this. You know, it may be initially all the person is looking for is a little reassurance and to know that there is an open door. The needs may be fairly to start with. They may not. You can't tell until you actually start to have these conversations. If you have an employee assistance program, then encourage your employee to use it. Consider what you can agree to in the short term and also on an ongoing basis. Your employee might want a temporary reduction in working hours and pay, or might want to try to juggle the work and care arrangements. So might say, can I work from home at flexible times during the day or the evening? Can I make up the time when the person being cared for is asleep, or when I've got somebody else who's able to cover the caring? Think of what you can do, but confirm any agreements in writing so that your expectations are clear. Just as we say to people who are talking about childcare cover and working from home, that actually working from home is not a substitute for having proper childcare in place. Equally, it isn't a substitute for having proper care in place as well. So, does your employee need more flexibility during working times than your rules normally allow? That's the sort of thing that I was referring to earlier, the use of mobile or other phone calls to take emergency calls, or to be able to come out on a regular basis and just make a quick call to monitor that things are okay at home. Or do they need to be on call in case of need? If it's likely that there will be regular short-term absences, can you offer any flexible options here, such as a flexi-time system, such as making the time off and having time off in lieu rather than having paid overtime, such as allowing authorised unpaid leave of a certain amount to cover such absences? If not, then actually can you bend your rules a little bit in terms of how holiday is taken? An awful lot of employers only allow holiday to be taken in full days. If you have somebody who is a carer, is it possible to allow them to take half days or even hours rather than full days? And what can you both do, and that includes the employee as well, to plan for an expected disruption? Is there any backup cover in place for key tasks? Are colleagues suitably trained? Now, Some employees consider employing people themselves in order to help with the load, whether it be carers who come in or cleaners or home help. If they're going to do that, then do remind them of the associated responsibilities, because your employee will then become an employer themselves. So all of the things that apply to your employee will apply to that person as well. So the minimum wage, holiday, sick pay, family leave, auto-enrolment, the right not to be unfairly dismissed, and the responsibility for tax and national insurance payments. In many cases, particularly if you're looking at short-term requirements, and particularly if you're looking at fluctuating requirements, it might be easier for them to use agency staff. Whilst the hourly rate will clearly be higher, the responsibilities will be taken care of by the agency, who can provide alternative people in the event of sickness or holiday absences. Now, the NHS will not recommend providers, so if you're a large employer, it might be worth having an internal online resource that enables carers to share recommendations and tips, and also to offer moral support to each other, because carers can feel very isolated and unsupported. And finally, finances. People who are caring may face unexpected expenditure whilst they apply for grants or caring allowance, or they may well have the funds themselves but need to give notice to withdraw money from savings accounts. And that's why I said giving your managers authority to authorise short-term salary advances or loans, that can be a godsend to some people. And power of attorney, many people leave it too late to put in place the power of attorney, which enables them to have control over an individual's finances and health decisions when that person's no longer able to manage this. Where appropriate, you may wish to remind your employees that this should be considered at an early stage, when the individual being cared for is mentally capable of signing these. Without a power of attorney, life is very, very difficult for the people who are responsible for organising the care of somebody. After 2 or 3 months, employees who have suddenly been faced with a caring situation can be tired, and they can be struggling even more than at the beginning, when they might have thought that the situation was temporary and short-term. And in many cases it's impossible, as I've said, to predict future requirements, so regular review meetings to discuss how things are going and amend the arrangements if necessary. Keep an open door so that your employee feels able to discuss any issues with you. And finally, don't forget the rest of the team. Things like team briefings, training sessions, updates, try and schedule them at times and venues that suit everybody, including your carer. Consider using Skype or GoToMeeting if the worker's home-based, so that everybody can participate, but also consider the rest of the team. Discuss with your employee how open any communications to them should be, and then ensure that the colleagues know what arrangements have been agreed and what adjustments they need to make to accommodate these. If it seems that some employees are allowed flexibility and others aren't, and the colleagues can't see any justification for the difference in treatment, or if it seems to them that the carers just aren't pulling their weight, then what starts out as initial sympathy can quickly turn into resentment, especially if the colleagues feel that the goodwill is being taken for granted. So managers do need to ensure that things are fair and that they are monitored and properly managed. So what further guidance can we give on this subject, given that it is something that's going to be cropping up more and more these days? Well, if you have access to our HR portal, we do have guides on time off for dependents and the right to request flexible working schemes. We also have a range of documents that you can tailor and use. The CIPD has published a guide. It's very aware of the fact that this is going to be a growing problem for employers that needs managing and looking after. So quite a detailed guide on creating an enabling future for carers in the workplace. And the website from Carers UK, which is a charity, also is a good one to point your employees to, because they offer quite a lot of advice and support, not just on financial things, but also moral support and people to talk to. So, any questions, or have I said everything that there is to be said about caring for people in the workplace? You may well think that I'm saying all of this from an employee's point of view, but in fact, let's just remind ourselves of the benefit that some of these employees give to us and the reasons why you actually might want to take these steps in order to retain them. So Radio 4 had a program the other morning actually which was all about carers and the difficulties that they faced, and it was sad how many employees did have to leave because they weren't able to get the flexibility that they needed in order to retain work. And as I said before, the people who are doing the caring could be your most skilled and responsible employees. Any questions at all? Right, we've had one in from somebody who says, we agreed to an employee working compressed hours whilst our employee was caring for her mother so that she could travel on a weekly basis to see her at her home, but she's now died. Can we ask our employee to revert to her previous working arrangements? Well, the answer to that actually is it depends on what you agreed originally. It's unusual to actually agree to something which ends once the person dies, but if you did make a temporary arrangement with that person, then yes, of course you can ask her to revert to her normal working pattern. But flexible working requests normally are a permanent change to the contract, so neither party can easily change them without the agreement of the other. What I would suggest is if you have a permanent arrangement that you can't actually get out of, then first of all, once your employee returns to work, sit down and see how she's feeling. There might still be an awful lot to be done in terms of administering the estate, so it might well be that the flexible arrangements that you have sorted out would be the best arrangement in the short term, or it might well be that that person prefers an alternative arrangement which is sensible and practical for both parties. That might give you an opening to help you to persuade the employee to agree to return to normal hours after that. It's also worth, of course, explaining that you can only offer flexibility to a limited number of staff and to see if you can reach agreement. But if you can't and the change was a permanent change to the contract, then the process to change the hours is a longer one, so we would advise you to take advice from us on that particular situation. Any other questions? No? In that case, can I hand back to you, Greg?
Hi, thank you for that, Alison. If anyone feels that they've got any other questions they want to talk to us offline about, then please feel free to do so. You can email our help desk at help@hrsolutions-uk.com and a member of the team will come back to you. Thank you for your time today. I hope you found it useful. Please watch out for further that we will be scheduling over the next couple of months, and we look forward to seeing you again shortly. Thanks for your time.